Welcome everyone who is here to the Futures of Settlement community. Thank you so much for being here. We're gonna launch into this thing that Marco and I have been brainstorming, I guess, for 2 years.
2 years.
I'm gonna make sure my slides work. There we go. Hi, I am Jen. I use she, her pronouns. I am second generation Chinese Canadian, and I was born and raised in Toronto, or Toronto, as you might colloquially know it. So before I begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that the work that I do is not possible without acknowledging the land and the water that nourishes me and where I am today. So today I am joining you for this call from my living room, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are part of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Wendat Nation, and also the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Six Nations, and many other nations, recorded and unrecorded. As I said, I'm on the land named Tagaranto, which means the trees meet the water, or the gathering place. I once saw a facilitator share her personal reconciliation story as a part of her land acknowledgement, and it stuck with me as to just how powerful a statement that can be. And so I'm going to take a few minutes to do so today. I'm a settler on the stolen land of Turtle Island, on a journey of personal reconciliation and moving towards reciprocity. I'm a mama of 2 children, and I am navigating my responsibility to them and to future generations. As a child of immigrant parents, I used to think that land acknowledgements didn't apply to me because I didn't think that my family or I were here when colonization happened, as if it were over and as if I wasn't benefiting from the harm that continues to live in our organizations, systems, policies, programs, and services. And despite growing up within the Canadian school system, so much of the truth about this country has been purposely and intentionally hidden. And so I work to learn, unlearn, and relearn so much of what I thought was true. For example, it was once pointed out to me that the lyrics of O Canada are my home and native land, when it should really be my home on native land. In my professional work as a design futurist, a facilitator, a coach, and a human being, I take great responsibility in honoring what has come before me and what I will leave behind for future generations. And I believe that we need to take a decolonized approach to this work. I live and work in the territories within the Dish with One Spoon covenant, and I work to uphold the intentions of this agreement, which is to take only what you need and to ensure that there's enough for those who follow. As of today, not a single treaty, signed or unsigned, within this country that we currently call Canada is honored in the way it was intended. And much of this land is unceded territory with no treaty at all, and so it remains as stolen land. The image that you're seeing on your screen is from nativeland.ca, which I think so beautifully illustrates the many relationships between Indigenous peoples. In Western culture, we often think of maps with straight lines of borders of ownership, whereas this map demonstrates to me the many overlapping relationships between Indigenous peoples' territories, languages, and treaties. And if you haven't done so already, I really invite you to go and explore this map, as well as where you are on your own personal journey of reconciliation. Thank you so much. So who are we? Well, that's a bigger question or a bigger conversation, but the first thing I'm going to do is actually invite you in the chat to answer these 3 questions. Where do you call home? Where are you joining us from today? And what is under your feet right now? So that is an invitation to think about where are our identities connected to? Where is the land that we're currently on? And to ground yourself in thinking about the surfaces that we're on. So I welcome you to do that in the chat, and we will continue to introduce ourselves. So as I mentioned, I am Jen, I use she, her pronouns, and I am second generation Chinese Canadian. And as I've continued to hone my own practice as an equity designer, I'm also going to share a practice I learned last year, which is to share a visual description of myself. We operate in a very ableist world where there is an assumption that we are starting from the same place. And with some really small gestures, we're able to create equity that really don't cost us a lot. So I am a female presenting Asian with dark hair, and it often has streaks of colors in it because I like to call it my superhero hair, and it is something I can control during a pandemic. And to be able to be sure that I can do the work that I do, I also think it's important to share some of the roles that I have. I personally am a designer, I'm professionally a designer, a researcher, a facilitator by nature, and I'm an idealist, a process-oriented person, and in constant search of meaning and belonging, and a serial idea generator. I'm also a mama, a partner, a friend, a daughter, a sister, and sometimes a boss. And that's because I am the CEO of the Department of Imaginary Affairs. The Department of Imaginary Affairs is a national nonprofit organization, and we are very much real, and no, we are not a part of the government. We were founded in 2015 with the ethos of what it would look like if the government ran with as much imagination as young people have. And we are working to imagine equitable futures. It is our mission to understand the evolving definition of what it means to be Canadian from new and developing Canadians. We work to elevate and amplify the stories of newcomers, immigrants, and youth, especially those who identify as BIPOC, because we believe that they are often underestimated when it comes to the design of empathetic programs, policies, and services. And in order to do that work, we think that we really need more Black, Indigenous, and people of color in leadership positions today. Our design process is centered on stories and how those stories lead us to artifacts of the future. And we think of those artifacts of the future as a demonstration of what is possible. And our jobs is to figure out why these artifacts didn't already exist and what conditions are needed for the artifacts to survive and thrive. We'll talk a lot more about artifacts today. And we really think of artifacts of the future as tangible versions of what is possible. And they're intended to provoke reactions and therefore actions. And we're invested so much in the process as much as we are in the outcome. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Marco, who is my co-conspirator in this Futures of Settlement work.
Jen, my name is Marco Campana. I identify as he, him pronouns. And I am also a Canadian-born child of immigrants from Italy and Switzerland. I'm also a dual Canadian and Swiss citizen. My visual description is I'm a Caucasian male with short brown but graying hair, with a goatee and sideburns, a single earring in my left ear, and a red hoodie, which is probably my most comfortable item of clothing. Excuse me, the roles I play in life: I'm a dad, a spouse, a son, a brother-in-law, an uncle, a cousin, a friend, a consultant, an ally, and very often a couch potato. The work I do is I'm a digital strategy transformation consultant for immigrant and refugee serving organizations with a focus on using technology in direct service delivery. In my work, I consult, I train, I write, and I curate and mobilize relevant information online, mainly through my websites and LinkedIn. And it's great to have everyone here. And as Jen is writing, please do introduce yourselves in the chat as well.
And while some of you are introducing yourselves, I thought maybe we would share a bit of who is joining us. So as Marco mentioned earlier, we had 100 people, almost 100 people register for this webinar. And so we also asked people to share with us a little bit about themselves. So 64% of you shared that you identify as first generation Canadian, over 16% second generation, and over 19% third generation or more. About half of you hold positions within the front lines or volunteers, and the other half are within management and senior leadership. And about half of you identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, while the other half of you don't. And so we just thought that this was an interesting way to start to get a sense of who is in this shared space with us when we are so when we can't see each other, when we're not in the same, we're not taking up space in the same ways that we used to. And so how much are we thinking about that while we navigate this conversation? So during this presentation, as we said, feel free to use this chat. It's open, find connections, ask questions. Like I mentioned before, there will be no microphones or cameras for the attendees in the first hour. So I really strongly encourage you to get comfortable knowing that there's no pressure for you to participate in a different way other than to really listen and process in whatever way you need to. While we're presenting, either Marco or I will always be monitoring the chat, and we'll answer questions in the chat that don't require urgent responses. If there's something that really needs urgency, we'll interrupt each other. And in the last 30 minutes of this session, we will open up the space for discussion. And at that time, microphones and cameras will be welcome. So with that, I know if this were me, I'd be taking a big exhale right now and being like, yes, I'm going to get my tea. I'm going to put my feet up. I'm going to not worry at all about if I need to go to the washroom or anything. It's like, you do what you need to do in this next bit in order for you to absorb. Whenever I facilitate, I like to offer a set of brave space ground rules. We're all about to enter a space of imagination, and that means suspending some of what you know to be true in order to stretch into new possibilities. So sometimes that stretching brings discomfort. So I want to remind you again that, of course, you are welcome to use that chat and to find connections and ask questions, and to use that space to seek clarification, and that when you are clear, that is kind. So if someone is bringing up something that you are not interested in engaging in, please be clear. Clear is kind. So also a reminder to take self-care. We're used to prioritizing the care of others, especially in community spaces. And this is a learning space, so we invite you to take deep breaths and respond only if and when you're ready. Not every statement or question needs to be addressed. And when you do engage, please remember to show up with an open heart and open ears. And if you're going to challenge something someone said, challenge the idea, not the person. So with all that said, we are curious to know what you're thinking as we move through this presentation. So feel free to share those musings, those comments, those questions throughout, and we will be mindful of where those things are at. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pass it over to Marco, and he is going to give us a lay of the land when it comes to settlement.
Thanks, Jen. So we're going to take a little bit of a look through settlement past, current, and future. And one of the things that I do a lot in workshops, although I'm focused on digital and hybrid and blended service delivery strategies, I like to remind people who are in particular new to the sector that we have some foundational past values. So in 2000, Canadian Council for Refugees, in consultation with the entire sector, started creating a standards framework. Now, a lot of people in the sector for a long time, but in particular newer people, have never seen this. And these are the kinds of values that when I started in the sector, we were taught. And we were expected to uphold. And so I like to introduce it to people. And again, we'll share links to all of the various resources in post-event. But I think as we look at the current and future, where we're grounded as a sector is really important when we look at access and inclusion. For a lot of people, the last 2 years around the resumption, if you will, of social justice and anti-racism and anti-oppression work has always been there in our sector, but over time it's been sort of something that's been de-emphasized. But it is part of the core of the values of our sector when it comes to talking about how we deliver services, how we create services, how we envision them. We're talking about respecting individuals, client empowerment. And again, I know that these tend to be buzzwords, but it's really looking at things like user-defined, cultural sensitivity, working in community development. We're not just doing transactional kind of work, and really looking at being accountable, being open to the work that we're doing. So I encourage you to, when we send the link, to look through this, but I give this to people as a sense of this is where our sector started, not started, but has had discussions around what we think are values, how we want to approach our work. And it's not just transactional service delivery. It is community development. It is popular education models and things like that. Next slide, please. And speaking of that, so when I came into the sector, I was educated to do the work using social justice, popular education, community engagement models. And one source in particular is called Educating for a Change, and they created this spiral model of how you do community work, of how you work with people. And it really always starts with the experience and knowledge of the participants and moves through with them as you're building, right? We call it needs assessment now. We use language like that. But at the time, what we talked about a lot was the idea of nothing with them without them, right? We hear that as a refugee mantra recently, nothing for us without us, right? People need to be involved in every step of the process when we're creating ideas, when we're building programs and things like that. And through it all, we were expected to challenge unequal power relations. Again, that baseline, that root in our sector of justice, the sense of addressing power, of addressing racism in particular, or other isms, as we came to become more aware of them. And so our roots are really in this area. And once again, for me, this is connected to those values, but this is a way to implement those values, is we don't start anything without working with the people that we are going to work on, if you will, but we work with them. So in the present, we see a different kind of language that's being used. In some cases, this comes out of technology. Some cases, it comes out of user design. In some cases, it's coming out of social innovation. But we hear about service design, human-centered design, user or client-centered design. We hear about user lab processes and things like that. And the language is very different, and it comes from outside of our sector in many ways, but it's being used within our sector. In a lot of cases, it's being used to create power differentials, because the language is almost like an elite language. If you don't understand the language, you are treated as though you couldn't possibly understand the concepts behind them. But as I was just showing you, these are the same concepts that have been grounding and root our sector and are the foundations of our sector for many, many years. So when we bring these kinds of conversations into the sector, we need to bring them in acknowledging that they're not new for us. The language is new, but the ideas behind them, the wishes to be human-centered and user and client-centered are not new to our sector. And that we need to find almost cultural interpretation between the ideas that are promoted as new with the ideas that we've always had in our sector, to look at the fact that we can come together on some of these, and that the processes that people are introducing are valuable for us, even if the language is slightly different. And for the people bringing the language into our sector, they need to understand our roots and our foundation, and that we want this as well, and to not treat us in that kind of power differential of, we're coming in to help you understand how to do this kind of work, because we've always kind of done it. Recently on the side of our desk, but it's always been part of the way we do our work. So we start to see that in our work now, that this language, and this is a positive thing for us, that service design, human-centered processes are exactly the way we should and want to be doing work in our sector. But we need to be doing it recognizing that it's not necessarily new, it's just using a different language. So when we look at the present, what we're starting to see is the evolution of a digital settlement agency, right? So in this case, NetHope, an organization that supports international humanitarian organizations in their digital transformation, created a model for the digital nonprofit that looks at 6 core areas: people, processes, technology, data, investment, and readiness. And so this is my own half-baked take on their model and how we might apply it to our sector. And at the core is this notion always of the client-centric data in this case. We want to create a seamless client settlement experience journey, whether it's online or offline or a combination of the two. And when we're talking about people from their model, in our case, we're talking about professional development in our context, where we're building a competencies framework for our work that include knowledge mobilization and transfer. So this idea, again, of our core values. And what we're looking at professional development, it's not just digital. What are the competencies that every settlement worker, every manager, every leader should have in our sector? When we're talking about process, in this case, we're talking increasingly about digital and data maturity and risk frameworks. Frameworks we can not only build on, but learn from and borrow and customize from other places and implement in our sector. Our sector is not monolithic. We bring in and we have expertise from many different places. And so we need to be doing that in our own frameworks as well. So I talk a lot about bringing in frameworks from health and social work and education, even the private sector and public sectors, for example. There's a lot that we don't have to reinvent. Technology, in our case, because of our foundational values, needs to always be tempered with digital inclusion and equity. And this needs to align with those values of access, anti-oppression, and inclusion. And when we're thinking about readiness, this is where we're talking about those baselines in service delivery, where we have a common minimum standard or a floor of infrastructure and competencies that no agency and no individual worker should fall below. And obviously we can exceed those baselines and we should strive to, but at our core, we should always have access to build those baselines. So you as a worker should always be able to be expected to perform at a certain level, but be helped to get there, be provided with the professional development that you need. And when it comes to investments, I like to use what Alan Broadbent from the Maitrey Foundation once called the 3 I's of immigrant integration: intentionality, instruments, and investments. So we need to be strategic. We need to be intentional about what we're doing, but we need to have the right instruments, tactics, or technologies in order to address what we're being intentional about. And then we need investments in those instruments and in those strategies in order to make it happen. And data is key to all of this, the client-centric data model. So we put that at the center, once again, labeled as the client. And what we're really talking about is what I just talked about. We're being client-centric, fully understanding our clients and communities and working with them in order to create the client settlement journey that is most impactful for them, regardless of whether they even access our services directly. So understanding newcomers makes that technology and service intervention much easier, and it makes our decisions obvious. So what's possible in the future? Through all of this, what we're talking about and what we've heard a lot during the pandemic is the idea that we've moved into transactional services, right? Someone comes in, you give them a resume, they leave. Someone comes in, you give them a bit of information, they leave. But we're really trying to go back to our roots of community development, of looking at newcomers as more than just transactional people with needs. We're looking at them from an asset approach. We're looking at the idea of welcoming communities. We're looking at the idea that these are not just people who come and become part of our community, but that they are our community in the end, and that they also impact it and can shape it with us. And so that's partly what we're looking to talk about here. What are these potential futures? What could this look like in our sector in the future? So over to you, Jen.
Thanks. So Marco and I have been really thinking about and working on this concept of what is the futures of settlement, this community of practice, and I think it's really important to start with the how and the why. And so we came up with these 3 principles that we want to sort of test and work on together with each of you. And so the first one is around centering frontline workers' wisdom and experience within future visioning. The next one is growing our capacity to imagine futures now, and working out loud and in the open to invite collective understanding. And so each of these principles comes from a place of us seeing a lot of what Marco was talking about with the human-centered design and service design, and we're about to jump into another whole jargony world of foresight, and knowing that so much of that is happening with folks who are saying, okay, well, we're going to do the strategy work, and then you're going to do the service delivery, and that we're going to tell you how to do that, and that those things aren't actually coming together in a way that feels cohesive. And so what we're really saying is, for us, the futures of settlement starts with centering frontline workers in the process of bringing that wisdom and experience forward, and that we're all here together to be able to imagine those futures, and that working out loud means that we are constantly sharing, naming, and doing a lot of bringing what we're thinking about, questioning, challenged by, into a transparent environment, as opposed to waiting until it's all done and perfect and you can wrap a little pretty bow around it. And so it means actually having this continuous dialogue that's open-ended and can grow because of all the people who are participating in different ways. So we're gonna share some more of those that language that can be so exclusionary, but what we're working towards is actually opening this up as a discussion. And so we're very, very curious to know what you're thinking about as we start to share some of these descriptions and how you're seeing yourself in this work. We very much see every single person who works in settlement already doing foresight. And so this is the definition of foresight that we're working with, which is foresight is a thinking exercise intended to stretch our imaginations so that we can move beyond feeling stuck in the status quo and begin to move towards alternative futures. Foresight is not a crystal ball. It's a process of testing possible and plausible scenarios and seeing how we might react and therefore act. So right now, that's a lot of words. There's a lot of things in there that you're saying like, yeah, cool, imagination, yeah, the status quo, alternative futures. Like there's still stuff there that is maybe a little bit floaty in the clouds. So the goal here today is to try and like get into some of those pieces, but also to recognize that this is a much longer conversation than what will happen today. So by all means, if you are having questions bubble up for you, please share those so that can help us create that clarity. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the design futurist. It's the who we are as individuals coming into this process and how you likely already are one. So to us, a design futurist is someone who understands how to bring together what they're seeing in the past, what they know about what they're seeing in the present with what they know about the past and working towards building a better future. And that you're often someone who is quick to adapt to ever-changing environments rather than relying on tried and true solutions. And that's really why now more than ever, we think that the settlement sector needs design futurists. We, through the pandemic, have seen people very quickly shift and adapt and work on their feet. And not all of that gets to stay, because at some point people are like, whoa, we're going to get back to normal, like as if what we were doing before was working for everyone. And what we're saying is not everything was working for everyone. So how do we actually stay in some of this nimble environment and recognize where we can start actually actively designing the future as opposed to letting the future happen to us? So foresight is really about collecting information, creating meaning out of pieces of information, crafting stories, and planning for uncertainty. It is a messy process, as you can see by this illustration. So it's a lot about collecting and picking up pieces and wondering if it matters. It's about bringing those pieces of information together and saying, okay, well, do these three pieces of information actually influence each other? How do we actually hone those into narratives and worlds that we might want to actually interact with, or things that might want to make us have pause? And then how do we actually start to be strategic about what we're going to do? So it's a bit of operating in the proactive instead of the reactive. And it can also be a fairly biased process depending on who participates. So today we're really going to focus in on the data portion of this mess. And I'm going to share a bit about how I think about data. And I'm going to warn you again that it's a lot of information all at the same time. So I'd like to imagine that you'll all offer me some patience and curiosity as I work my way through this. And that I imagine that your questions and comments that'll happen in chat and then maybe afterwards will be really generative for where we'll go next. So I said we were going to get into the data. We're going to get into the stuff. So I think of this as artifacts, pieces of information often known as data that we can look at in order to begin to piece together what has been happening at the time. People are inherently storytellers by nature. It's how we make sense of things. So I think of artifacts as of the past as evidence of what was, artifacts of the present as evidence of what is, and then artifacts of the future as evidence of what might be possible. So that is still pretty theoretical looking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually share with you a version of how I understand what artifacts of the past, present, and future are. Maybe a bit of content warning. It is going to be about COVID. So for folks who have anxious feelings about COVID and how we're interacting in the world, know that I am going to share some images about me and my family as we've navigated COVID. And so if you need to take care of yourself, this is a good time to do so. So here are some artifacts of COVID. So there are about 9 different pictures here, images of things that are demonstrating how I think a little bit about COVID, past, present, and future. So the past, so you can see there pictures from March 2020. These are a few photos from what I think of as an entirely different world than the world we live in now. Our family took a trip to Miami from March 1st to March 7th. 2020. So if everyone zooms their brains back to March 1st to 7th of 2020, you might remember that this was when we were already hearing about coronavirus, but we weren't really sure what the impact was going to be on us. And so one of those pictures there is a picture of my partner and my oldest waiting for the Op Express. And the other one is a picture of our family on the plane. You'll notice that we don't have masks on in either picture. And I can remember being in Miami on a bus and seeing the news and them talking about coronavirus numbers increasing. And when we got back, my brother was like, oh, you should really consider quarantining. And I was like, what's that? Why would we do that? I have to go to work. And really at a moment where thinking about taking that separation from everyone else, that those commitments needed us to be present, it's really to me an entirely different world than the one we live in now. When I think about COVID present, so November 2021, these are a collection of pictures of COVID in my life now. So there's a picture of me and my youngest getting his second nose tickle of the month as an entry ticket back into daycare. It's a picture of a box outside of someone's house with a note on it that reads, free, no COVID, no bugs, no weirdness. There's another picture there of me eating takeout off of the back of our car because that's where we eat meals now when we don't want to go inside of restaurants. And there's one more there, which is just one of the many, many signs about social distancing in public spaces. And so each of those tells me that if I were to look, if like in 10 years from now, I were to look back at the present, what I would be remembering is that, yeah, there were certain new protocols that were in our life. There was new conversations. There were new things happening that are so different than how I understood life in March 2020. So when I look at November 2021, I can see very much how COVID is present in our lives. It feels like there are things that we need to do, things that need to be communicated in ways that are so different than what was happening in March 2020. And when I think about the future, what it starts to make me think about and wonder is what will remain from COVID life as I know it today in 10 or 20 years. So there's a picture there of a mask discarded in the woods. It's all tangled up. And there's a picture of my vaccine passport from the first time that I went for indoor dining last week. And there's a picture of my kids with masks on inside of our condo elevator. I can remember a time when I used to think, oh, we won't need masks. It's not a thing. And to me, I still kind of wonder, like, how much of this will linger in our lives, and what, yeah, like if I fast forward to 10 or 20 years from now, will I look back at today's dates and go, oh, remember when we used to do that? Or will it actually be something that is still existing in our lives? And how do we what reactions does that make for me, and how does that make me want to act? That's really one version of how we look at artifacts. I'm going to do one more version of this. So these are artifacts of my run. So just to add an entirely other layer to this, as design futurists, we tend to think of data in 5 categories. We call this STEEP. So STEEP stands for, S is for social, T is for technological, E is for environmental, the other E is for economic, and then P is for political. So social is about the human systems we interact with, which typically includes how we take care of ourselves. Technological is about physical innovations that we interact with, and this typically includes the machines we rely on. Environmental is about natural resources that we interact with, and this typically includes all the things that Mother Nature offers us. Economic is about capitalistic systems that we interact with, and typically this includes our relationships with supply and demand, or scarcity and abundance. And then political is about the governing systems we interact with, and this typically includes the power and authority to make the rules we follow. So those are, again, another really big theoretical way of thinking about what are the things that are in our lives. And so I wanted to show this in a way where it was hopefully relatable to you in ways that you can see how this might show up in your day-to-day life. So this is my run in November 2021. So the first thing that you're seeing there is social, which is actually a screenshot of this new game that I started playing called Pikmin Bloom. It is an augmented reality thing that connects me to wanting to walk and wanting to take care of myself and wanting to take steps. And so I started that in November, and it's very much an encouraging way of motivating me to get moving and to get those steps. The next one is technological. Both of these things are rooted in my cell phone, and it's a Nike running app. So it's again another piece of data for me that keeps me motivated and knowing where I'm at. Environmentally, this was November, and it was, I think, probably unseasonably sunny and warm, and so going for a run felt extremely nourishing and healing, and so I was able to, like, in combination, bring those things together. Economic, so that picture you're seeing in the bottom with a coffee cup and notebooks and stuff is my relationship to work. I'm able to do this at a time where, you know, being able to take care of myself physically also helps me take care of myself mentally. And so I was at a cafe and able to then recuperate after a run, and be able to be able to take both of those things at the same time. And politically, my children are in school because school is open now, and in daycare. And that's another thing that sort of operates in our worlds that allows me to be able to be on a run on a Monday morning. And so these are things that I would like to think are examples of things that you could see in your life too. And these are things that we will definitely dive more into as we go into Futures of Settlement. But I wanted to give those examples as ways that we think about how data and information and story and understanding of data exists in our everyday lives. So I'm going to show this visual one more time about that mess, and the things that I just showed you are really just the things that exist in the messy data, all these dot portions of this, and then as what I was doing is starting to push it into the sense making, which was, okay, well, how do I bring some of these things together in understanding why it was possible for me to go for a run in November, and why I was doing it, what was motivating me, what was bringing my what was allowing me to be able to do that. And there was all sorts of other things that are social and technological and environmental and economic and political that were happening at the same time. So things like the traffic lights that were mediating the flow, or the way that I was able to I was really motivated to be like, how many runs can I actually get? And how do I collect that data about myself? And then being like, can I keep that up for next week and the week after and the week after? And so we start to be able to see behaviors and patterns. And that's really what sense making is really about. And then as we move that into scenarios, it's like, well, what are the stories? What's the possibility there? So if you were to look at all that data about my run and say, oh, it looks like you're a really avid runner. Well, you might know that, as that week was especially stressful for me. So getting my body moving was really helpful. But the other thing that happens is my momentum dies down when the weather changes. And so it's again a thing where we're starting to figure out what are the stories and what's the narrative. And then when we move into strategic, it's like, well, if I actually want to keep running, then what do I do to actually keep myself motivated when those things that were motivating me in November maybe are not motivating me in December? And so again, it's really about how we interact with all those systems. That's a lot of information. But what I wanted to share next, before we open this up for discussion, is what we imagine is next. That there are people here that are part of this group that are actually going to join us in building the futures of settlement. So that you will join us in participatory monthly gatherings of getting into understanding the data. What's the data in your life? What's the data that's happening in your client's life? What are the things that we should be paying attention to within settlement that are actually demonstrating of other bigger things that are happening maybe across the country or regionally or across the entire world? And so that's an invitation to really be with us on this, in this work, and being with us in the open. And then there are people here who are going to be like, I love what you're doing, but I don't have the time or the capacity right now to be that participatory. And so there might be some of you who would like to just be on the journey with us. You're curious, you want to watch and observe and learn, but you're not going to come to a monthly thing. And so again, what I said when we were talking about learning in the open is that we really want to have a community forum, we want to have blog posts, we want to have podcasts, we want to be able to make artifacts of what we're learning and thinking about now. And then we're also going to open up for, similar to today, these quarterly webinars where we're going to have sort of like broader conversations about what we're learning. And again, that will sort of influence where we go in the building of the futures of settlement.
Thank you for that overview. We don't have any specific questions from the chat, but do we want to open up everyone's mics and video and see where people are at? Just to give some additional context to folks, this is just a Jen and Marco on the sides of our desk kind of project. Like she said, we've been talking about this for a couple of years and we've gone for some funding and haven't gotten it, but we like the idea enough to play with it. And so the participatory monthly gathering is really trying to bring a group of people, the same group ideally, through this foresight process that Jen would lead. And our hope there is that it'll be an interesting and useful process, but it's also a learning process for folks about another way of planning programs, so another way of looking at how you can build your services or build your community development programs in your own community to help you think about, okay, well, we're not just sort of working towards a future that we're not sure of, but we can define it. We can identify what the plausible scenarios might be and then work towards those to make it sort of more active and action oriented.